On August 26, 1071 AD, the Eastern Roman army was defeated by the Seljuk Turks at the Battle of Manzikert. The Romans' defeat led to the Seljuk Turks becoming the rising power in Anatolia. This was the first and only time a Roman emperor was captured by a Muslim army. The cocky Romanos IV, who personally led the army deep into Anatolia to crush the Seljuk Turks' uprising. The emperor unfortunately had to learn the hard way about hiring an army full of mercenaries, especially those whom are kinfolk to your enemy. Romanos and his army of over 40,000 strong, comprised of mostly Frankish, Armenian, and Turkish mercenaries, marched across Anatolia to confront the Seljuks, who were invading Roman territory in the eastern frontier. The long march took a few months to reach its destiny, but during the travels, the locals weren't too happy about having the emperor's Frankish mercenaries loot and plunder their towns. About two-thirds through the march, Romanos split his army into two, but when they reached Manzikert, the second half of his attack force, led by his trusted general, Tarquinides, disappeared, leaving the emperor with a very small group. Despite having half of his soldiers unavailable for combat, Romanos turned down the Seljuks' peace talks and wanted to settle their raids into the Roman lands once and for all. But when his line of Turkish mercenaries lined up for battle, many of them saw their relatives in the enemy's ranks and decided to quit and ran off. On August 26, despite having less than 20,000 soldiers, Romanos decided to launch an attack on the Seljuks. The Sultan of the Seljuks, Alp Arslan, did not want to fight the Eastern Romans and tried to negotiate a peace treaty with Romanos, who refused to grant him an audience, prepared for battle. A soldier reported to Arslan, "My Sultan, the enemy army is approaching," and he replied, "Then we are approaching them." The Turkish horse archers pelted the Eastern Roman army with waves of arrows as they formed a crescent-shaped formation around their attackers. The Eastern Romans marched towards Alp Arslan's camp and managed to capture it, but it was a costly one for this small victory because they sustained very heavy losses. The high body count that Romanos' army suffered, along with the hit-and-run tactics used by the Seljuk cavalry, threw the battle into one giant ball of confusion. The final nail in the coffin for the Eastern Romans was the betrayal of the emperor's support troops led by his political rival's son, Andronicus Ducas, whom he brought along despite protests from his advisors who warned him of something like this happening. Ducas pulled his soldiers from the battle and headed back towards their base camp. With no support troops and heavily outnumbered, Romanos' personal soldiers, the Varangian Guard, and his Armenian infantry held their ground to protect the emperor, who was fighting alongside with them, fought a brutal hand-to-hand melee before they were completely overwhelmed by the Seljuks. After the battle was over, the Seljuks went through the dead and wounded and discovered the Eastern Roman emperor was amongst the wounded, and he was brought before the Sultan. When Arslan discovered that the dirtied and bloody man before him was Romanos, he placed his boot on his neck and forced him to kiss the ground, a Turkish traditional gesture of submission. After the ceremony was completed, Arslan offered the emperor the same peace treaty he tried to get him to agree to before the hostilities began. Romanos was ransomed back to Constantinople for over 1.5 million nomeses. He was taken home by a Turkish escort who carried a banner alongside the emperor that read, "There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger." When he arrived back to Constantinople, Romanus was a disgraced ruler who was eventually defeated in battle by the man who betrayed him at Manzikert, Andronicus Ducas. Before surrendering, Romanos collected his ransom money and had it sent to the Sultan with a letter saying, "As emperor, I promised you a ransom of 1.5 million. Dethroned and about to become dependent upon others, I send you all I possess as proof of my gratitude." As part of his surrender, he resigned as emperor and retired as a monk, but he was betrayed and was blinded and died a year later.